My name is Ila Chandavarkar, and I live in Cambridge and work with a number of organizations primarily around race equality. For me, a really pivotal moment in my life was the Indian emergency in 1975. It was just before I came to live in Cambridge. And I think when it first started, I thought, it's just a mask that's been removed. This has been the way that things have worked all along. But very shortly, I saw the impact of that. So, the press was muzzled. And I think just what it meant to have no legal rights. I mean, people went to jail, there was no judicial process. There was suppression of trade union activity and a whole lot of other things that came in. I think Indira Gandhi's son, Sanjay Gandhi, led on a kind of mass vasectomy program. And I think a lot of it was forced. And it impacted mainly on people who, were poor. And there was also a big slum clearance where people were just forcibly moved further away from where their workplaces were. And as I said, people just went to jail. A friend of my mother's died in jail because she wasn't given the medication she needed. And she'd committed no crime other than supporting the opposition. So, I think for me, then it made me understand what it actually meant to live in a society where there wasn't a democracy. So, really valuing it, however flawed it is in practice. I think the work that I do is very closely connected. It's probably no surprise that voting levels are much lower in Black and minoritized ethnic communities. And I work with an organization called Voice4Change England, which is a national organization it's a membership organization. And I think had quite a strong campaign to stop voter ID when it was first mooted because they thought voting levels are already low, particularly amongst young people, and they probably get even lower. So the campaign received some funding to encourage BME people to vote in London. And we realized when running those activities that we actually needed to go a bit wider and have more of a kind of political literacy campaign. And I think we're planning to take that wider across the country. So again, it's a question of getting the funding for the work, but we already run programs for BME groups across the country. I also work with Cambridge Ethnic Community Forum, and we run civic participation sessions from time to time. And I don't think it's just within BME communities. I'm actually surprised of how little people know about local democracy. And I think if you want a democratic system, you've got to know how it works in the area you're in. So I've been quite involved with things like that, with these kind of sessions. I think more needs to be done. I feel that schools, they're talking about lowering the voting age to 16. I think schools should have proper citizenship programs. They've been tinkered with, and hardly any schools offer the GCSEs now in citizenship. So you really need that if you're going to think of how people participate in democracy, or how they, make sure that they know what they want from it. Voice4Change England has just got some funding. Again, it's London, but we're trying to apply to other sources to take it wider, to look at what the root causes of race inequality are, to look at what would be needed for system change, because otherwise it's like a revolving door. You can help a certain number of people, and then you find that the same things are happening to the next group along. Democracy is is sort of a fundamental part of this, of getting people to, I mean, again, this is work I do with Cambridge Ethnic Community Forum. It's sort of working with BME groups and finding that a lot of them believe they've got to have systems in place because that's what the practice in the UK requires, but they're not looking at it and saying, how does this work for me? You know, if you actually write a constitution, how does our group operate? And to me, that's like one level of democracy. How do you actually run a democratic group? And how does your constitution guarantee that? So a lot of my work is caught up with that, with making people to see it's the rules that they need for themselves and their group, and it's got to work for them. I think it started out with my interest in equalities, and it started out with gender equality in the 80s. It was quite a big movement, and I was actually a member of Wages for Housework. I don't know if you remember. Now, they had a book that they brought out. I think it was called Bringing It All Back Home. And it was about the experiences of two Black women, one who'd migrated to the US and one who'd migrated to the UK. And it looked at gender and race inequality. And I was quite involved with the launch. By that time, the UK woman, had become Christian, so she wasn't so politically active in that way. And so it was just the woman who'd gone to the States. And she was inspiring, really. I mean, I can remember her talking about how she felt she had to learn how to fit in. You know, she had chewing gum, sort of fitting in with her peers, and how different her two lives were. And I think that brought me into, and it made me recognize that people who experience inequalities are probably the people who are not participating as fully as they could for all sorts of complex reasons. And I began to see that in my life and how it impacted on my life. And I think that's how I got very involved with the kind of work I'm doing. Well, I think the fault lines for me are a lot to do with rising inequalities. I mean, growing poverty, unequal distribution of resources that's growing. And I think it's at a time when people, I don't know how to put it, but they sort of button down, really. They feel they're struggling so much that they don't really get involved much more. I heard somebody talking about someone she'd met who was going to vote reform, and she said, what are their policies that you like? And he didn't know. He was just going to vote for them because they weren't the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. And he didn't care what their policies were. And I think that's a bit of a dangerous point in democracy. I mean, again, I can remember reading a newspaper article when the Labour Party first proposed lowering the voting age. It said that one of the universities had done a sort of study and found that 70% of young people under 18 didn't know who their MP was. It's a way we're living. It's a kind of individualism that's been encouraged, if you like. We don't see ourselves as belonging in a community or a society. And I think that's a very dangerous point. I remember reading Vera Brittain, Testament of You. She talks about it before the World War, because she said she blames a kind of comfortable Victorian prosperity that had led people to think that they could just lead these very safe and individual lives, and what happened outside their homes didn't matter. And she describes this thing of thinking, well, politics doesn't really affect me. I just have my life, without realizing that politics affects everyone, whether you think you're involved in it or not. I think reviving a good citizenship program in schools is a really important bit. It's finding ways to engage people. I mean, I think we're all affected by globalization. So it's hard to think of our locality as a community as such. But I think it's finding ways to see where we do belong physically in societies, even if we have virtual communities that we're part of, because we're still in countries and we need to think about how the country works for everyone in it, really. I think some of the things that I was saying I saw in the emergency would be really important, that there's an active press. It's interesting when we're talking that you can see what's happening in the US, sort of curtailing how universities or television programs or media, and that it seems to just be happening. So it needs a very active press. It needs accountability. I think that if you have power, that there are checks and balances. Some years ago, can't even remember, it must have been Cameron's government, because it was Chris Grayling, brought in there was a review about judicial reviews. And it was really interesting reading it, reading the government document, but because it was almost like Parliament is supreme and Parliament knows what's good for everybody. So not the judiciary, not the public. That didn't need to be anything. Parliament, it just needed Parliament to be. In the end, they didn't bring in the kind of changes they were going to, but they did raise charges. It was a deterrent, even if the law stayed the same around judicial reviews. I think I should go back and find that sentence about how Parliament is the supreme authority, because it is such a fantastic sentence and so obviously an anti-democratic statement. I just find it interesting that all the populist stuff has this thing about equality, and we definitely need to have equalities legislation and civil rights that people know apply to everybody. I was reading that one of the planks of reforms anti-migration is to remove indefinite leave status and remove and extend, the bit about public funds. You can't access public funds regardless of what your status is. So it's obvious that when parties come up with these kind of statements, that they're actually talking about non-universal rights. Only some people have rights and others don't. So that's a really central plank of having a flourishing democracy, that people do have universal rights. And it's interesting because that's gone from parties like Reform to the Labour Party. I mean, they've been talking about maybe coming out of the European Convention of Human Rights. And this is a party that is founded on principles of social justice. But I think that's really important. And for people to discover, I mean, I talked about groups being democratic, and that's actually quite a difficult thing to do in a community group, to be democratic in your group, but being involved in that, being able to understand how you have that and it works. Really, it would be good to see how we can work towards what I consider little democracies, to be able to understand bigger democracies. And that's why I think it's really important that we have education, if you like, as the sort of foundation of it.